Ancient Egypt is often remembered as a land of temples, gods, and eternity. But behind the monuments stood a civilization built on war. Egypt did not survive for thousands of years by peace alone. It survived by force, by discipline, and by a carefully controlled system of violence. War in ancient Egypt was not chaos. It was order, imposed through blood. The Egyptians believed the world existed in a fragile balance called Ma'at, cosmic harmony. Anything beyond Egypt's borders represented chaos, disorder, threat. To fight a war was not simply to defend territory, it was to restore cosmic balance. Every enemy was an enemy of the gods. This belief shaped how Egypt fought. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of divine power. When the pharaoh went to war, it was not politics, it was ritual. Reliefs carved into temple walls show him towering over enemies, crushing skulls, striking down dozens at once. This was not exaggeration, it was theology. The pharaoh had to be seen as invincible. If he appeared weak, the universe itself was at risk. Egyptian wars were carefully planned. Most campaigns were seasonal. Armies marched after the Nile flood when food was available and farmers could be conscripted. The army was not a permanent force in early periods. It was made of ordinary men, peasants pulled from fields, trained just enough to survive. They fought not for glory, but for obligation. Disobedience was treason against both king and gods. Weapons were simple but effective. Infantry carried spears, axes, and short swords. Bows were common. Egyptian archers were feared for their accuracy. Shields were made of wood and leather, offering limited protection. Armor was rare. Most soldiers entered battle knowing one mistake meant death. Chariots changed everything. Introduced during the New Kingdom, they turned Egyptian warfare into mobile domination.
Lightweight, fast, pulled by trained horses, chariots allowed archers to strike from a distance and disappear before enemies could respond. The pharaoh often rode in a chariot himself, not necessarily to fight, but to be seen. Visibility was power. Enemies needed to believe resistance was pointless. Egypt did not fight wars to annihilate nations. It fought to intimidate, control, and extract. Tribute mattered more than territory. Gold, grain, slaves, livestock. These were the true rewards of conquest. Prisoners were marched back to Egypt, displayed in triumphal processions. Some were forced into labor. Others were executed publicly. Hands or heads were counted after battles to record victories. War was bureaucratic. Even brutality was documented. Siege warfare was rare but devastating. Egyptian armies surrounded cities, cut supply lines, and waited. Starvation broke resistance faster than blades. If a city fell, punishment was severe, meant to serve as an example. Mercy was weakness. Psychological warfare played a major role. Messengers were sent ahead, describing what happened to those who resisted. Reliefs showing massacres were deliberately placed in temples where foreign envoys would see them. Fear was a weapon. But Egypt also fought defensive wars. Nomadic raids from the desert, invasions from the north, powerful rivals like the Hittites. These conflicts forced Egypt to adapt. Fortresses were built along borders. Professional soldiers emerged. Military ranks became formal. War was no longer occasional. It became institutional. Religion remained at the center. Before battle, priests performed rituals. Omens were read. gods were consulted. Victory meant divine favor. Defeat meant divine displeasure. There was no concept of failure without guilt. The gods had to be appeased, and when appeasement failed, blood followed. As Egypt's power grew, its wars became larger, colder, and more systematic.
What began as seasonal raids slowly transformed into campaigns of domination. The new kingdom marked the peak of Egyptian military force. This was the age of professional soldiers, standing armies, and permanent garrisons. Men were no longer farmers who fought when called. They were trained to kill. Military units were divided by rank, weapon type, and experience. Officers enforced discipline with absolute authority. Desertion was punishable by death. Cowardice was treason. Training was harsh. Soldiers learned to march long distances under the sun with minimal water. They trained with real weapons, not practice tools. Injuries were expected. Survival was the test. Battle itself was brutal and personal. There were no formations like later armies would use. Combat dissolved into close-range violence. Spears shattered shields, axes crushed bone. Arrows fell in volleys, darkening the sky. Wounds were almost always fatal, not from the blow, but from infection. There were no medics, no evacuation. If you fell, you were left behind. Chariots dominated the battlefield, but they were fragile. A single broken wheel meant death. Enemies targeted horses first, knowing a fallen chariot exposed its crew instantly. Despite royal imagery, pharaohs rarely fought directly. They commanded, inspired, and symbolized power. The famous Battle of Kadesh is a perfect example. Official records depict Ramses II single-handedly defeating thousands of Hittites. Reality was far less glorious. The battle was chaotic, nearly disastrous. Egypt survived not through divine miracle, but through discipline and reinforcements. Yet the propaganda mattered more than truth. Victory was carved into stone. Truth died on the battlefield. Captured enemies faced terrifying fates. High-ranking prisoners were paraded before temples and executed in ritual ceremonies. Their deaths were offerings to the gods. Common soldiers were enslaved. They built monuments, worked mines, Rowed ships. Entire populations were relocated to weaken resistance. Children of captives were raised as Egyptians, stripped of identity. War erased cultures quietly. Egypt also mastered psychological domination after battle. Defeated rulers were forced to kneel, kiss the ground, and swear loyalty before the pharaoh. Rebellion meant annihilation. Egypt did not rule through constant violence, but through the memory of it. Borders were marked by fortresses and warning stelae. These monuments listed the pharaoh's victories in graphic detail. They were not history, they were threats. Religion continued to justify every blade. Gods marched with the army in the form of sacred standards. If a standard fell, morale collapsed. Soldiers believed death in battle could earn divine favor, but only if the pharaoh was victorious. If Egypt lost, the dead were forgotten. There was no honor in defeat. War also shaped Egyptian society at home. Taxes increased to fund campaigns. Temples grew rich from war spoils. Priests gained power as interpreters of victory and failure. War fed religion. Religion fed war. And both fed the state. Despite its reputation for stability, Egypt lived in constant preparation for conflict. Peace was temporary. Balance was fragile. Every generation trained for the next war. And yet, Egypt eventually fell, not from a single enemy, but from exhaustion. Endless campaigns drained manpower. Professional armies demanded resources. Foreign powers learned Egyptian tactics and improved upon them. When war no longer guaranteed divine favor, the system collapsed. The gods fell silent. What remains is stone, reliefs of victories that never fully happened, statues of kings who claimed eternal dominance, and beneath them, the truth. Ancient Egypt did not endure because it avoided war. It endured because it mastered it, until war mastered Egypt in return.